They wanted to know if I had talked to Giuliani. That is what one recipient of a Justice Department subpoena said, with Justice Department now launching a new round of subpoenas armed at the Trump fraudulent elector conspiracy. The breaking news of the night is a new round of subpoenas from the Justice Department, with the Washington Post breaking the news. The Justice Department's investigation into the January 6th attack ratcheted up Wednesday as federal agents dropped subpoenas on people in at least 2 states in what appeared to be a widening probe of how political activists supporting President Donald Trump tried to use invalid electors to thwart Joe Biden's 2020 electoral victory. The New York Times has added to this reporting that the subpoenas have been delivered in possibly 3 states, Georgia, Arizona, and Michigan. The Washington Post reports one would-be Trump elector in Georgia, Patrick Gartland, had been appointed to the Cobb County Board of Elections and Registration and believed that post meant serving as an elector would have created a conflict of interest for him. Still, 2 FBI agents recently came to his home with a subpoena and asked whether he had any contact with Trump advisors around the time of the November election. They wanted to know if I had talked to Giuliani, Gartland said. The Washington Post reports agents conducted court-authorized law enforcement activity Wednesday morning at different locations. FBI officials confirmed to the Washington Post one was the home of Brad Carver, a Georgia lawyer who allegedly signed a document claiming to be a Trump elector. The other was the Virginia home of Thomas Lane, who worked on the Trump campaign's efforts in Arizona and New Mexico. Joining us now, Paul Butler, law professor at Georgetown University and a former federal prosecutor. Also, Glenn Kirshner is with us, a former federal prosecutor. They're both MSNBC legal analysts. Professor Butler, you go to prison if you impersonate an FBI agent. What happens to you if you impersonate an elector?
You should go to prison. So, Lawrence, this is the encouraging sign we needed, that the Justice Department isn't just watching the January 6th congressional hearings, but they're conducting their own parallel investigation. And they're not just focused on January 6th as Insurrection Day, but rather they're looking at the whole broad sweep of President Trump's criminality. And this is on top of what we learned a few weeks ago, that federal prosecutors are also looking at Giuliani and John Eastman and promoting this ridiculous plan. Lawrence, hopefully one of the subjects of this criminal investigation is Donald Trump, who kept pushing this fake election conspiracy even after being advised that it was illegal and unconstitutional.
And Glenn, it seems that the logic of the investigation that these subpoenas seem to represent spirals upward very quickly. If you're giving a subpoena to someone who signed his name fraudulently as an elector, question 1 is going to be, who asked you to do that? Once you get that name, you go to that person and ask who asked you to ask him. And it seems like you might not be very far from Donald Trump as you start asking those questions.
You know, Lawrence, it does feel like maybe the Department of Justice is beginning to work its way up to the command structure of the insurrection, not just the foot soldiers who, you know, DOJ has been doing a bang-up job holding the foot soldiers accountable, the people who, by and large, were simply taking orders from and obeying orders from Donald Trump to go to the Capitol, fight like hell or you won't have a country. Now stop the certification, or as President Trump said, stop the steal, which is actually helpful because the word steal helps prove his criminal intent. But yes, it does feel like they're working their way up the criminal ladder. I find it a little curious that these subpoenas come immediately after we, the people, saw these public hearings that have been really, I think, wonderfully done by the J6 committee. And all of a sudden, DOJ seems to be binge watching and acting accordingly. I don't mean to be snarky, but this old federal prosecutor is used to seeing witnesses handled first by prosecutors in the grand jury, and then second by other congressional committees or governmental agencies that also need the testimony of those witnesses for their own purposes. So this is a curiosity, and I still hope that there is a method to what seems like a little bit of investigative madness.
Paul Butler, what do you suppose this might mean or tell us about possible lines of inquiry for Fani Willis, the district attorney in Atlanta, who is looking into election crimes possibly committed by Donald Trump by phone in calling Secretary Raffensperger? Might she also take an interest in the fraudulent electors?
I think she has to. Again, there can be parallel federal and state investigations and separate prosecutions. And Lawrence, the closest we have to smoking gun evidence against Donald Trump is on that telephone call he had with the Secretary of State in Georgia, where he asked for the specific number of votes he needed. That indicated he didn't care who really won the election. He wanted to stay in office by any means necessary. And so will there be sharing of information between the federal criminal investigation and the Georgia investigation? Hopefully there will be. Hopefully the House will also share its information with the Georgia officials if there is, in fact, a prosecution.
Glenn, what kind of cooperation, if any, is there between a local state prosecutor and federal prosecutors when, if you're Fani Willis today and you see federal subpoenas flying in Georgia in an arena that you're investigating, does someone pick up the phone and do they start talking to each other?
Yeah, Lawrence, in a perfect world, there is lots of coordination that should go on between federal law enforcement authorities and local and state prosecutors. When I was a federal prosecutor at the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office, we often had overlap with the jurisdictions of Maryland and Virginia, and we communicated early and often with local prosecutors, state prosecutors, Commonwealth prosecutors. And in a perfect world, that's how it should happen. Now, I will say it's largely dependent on the personalities that are involved, U.S. attorney, state's attorney, Commonwealth's attorney. But in a case this important, impacting the future health and viability of our democracy, I sure hope that they are coordinating across jurisdictional lines, federal government and state government.
Glenn Kirshner and Paul Butler, thank you for your combined expertise on this one tonight. Really appreciate it. Leading off our coverage tonight, J. David Goodman, Houston bureau chief for the New York Times, and Tony Plahetsky, investigative reporter for the Austin American-Statesman. Tony, I have to say, this kind of open warfare was not something I saw coming last week.
Well, I don't think any of us did. But at the same time, when we begin to see these facts finally start to roll out, some of it from public testimony, as you mentioned, given by Steve McGraw yesterday, but also, in addition to that, additional information coming to light from sources who have been able to share information. I was able to watch a video, some of the security video from the school the day that this was happening. And when you look at that and you look at the facts as they are starting to come out, clearly the effort to conceal information and to hide information is, as you mentioned, falling apart. We are finally, 1 month and 1 day later, starting to get some real truth and some real facts out there. And clearly there are people who don't like that and who are finding the truth very difficult to hear. And frankly, it is a difficult truth.
And David, I know we've all been listening. You've been listening for verification of your own reporting and reporting of others as things are being revealed as they were yesterday, for example. And now we are at the point where the state officials anyway are saying those classroom doors, they were not locked and no one ever checked them. And that's exactly where your reporting was leading us.
That's right. I mean, I do want to say one thing that actually does remain somewhat uncertain is that McGraw was quite deliberate in not exactly saying that they weren't locked. What he said was they weren't secured. And I think it's probably a moot point because none of the officers were seen on video checking the doors to see if they were locked. And clearly the gunman was able to get into that classroom with, unimpeded, suggesting that the door was unsecured as McGraw was saying. And he demonstrated yesterday during the hearing that these doors could only be locked with a key from the outside. And so clearly something was either wrong with that door or made it so it wasn't secured and closed in a way that would have prevented him from getting in there. And that's what we had seen and heard early on, that though Chief Arredondo was insisting that the doors were locked and spent a very an excruciatingly long time looking for a key, as McCraw said yesterday, it wasn't needed. And that's really a painful realization and a painful detail to have publicly stated by the head of the police in Texas.
David Goodman and Tony Plahetsky, thank you for your reporting, and thank you for joining us again tonight. Joining us now is Texas State Senator Roland Gutierrez. He represents Texas' 19th district, which includes Uvalde. And Senator, you have filed a lawsuit. This is against the Texas State Department of Public Safety to get information. What is this lawsuit aimed at?
Well, Lawrence, first off, thank you very much. We filed a lawsuit because we filed an open records request back in May 31st. 10 days passed and the agency did not respond to us in any way, nor did they take exception with our response to the Attorney General's office. So we had the ability to be able to ask for the things that we were asking for. Now we're asking for a court to decide this. We're asking for the logistical information as to where the DPS troopers were. We learned a lot yesterday from the hearing that was in the Senate, but clearly it was all an established narrative. We learned that there was 91 state troopers on site, 12 of which were in that hallway. Quite frankly, they weren't in there for any real length of time. Additionally, we learned that those troopers weren't directed by Arredondo or anybody, quite frankly. We also learned that the majority of these troopers were from Operation Lone Star, and the state troopers command and control officers were on scene. Why in the world did they not go and do what they needed to get done? Why didn't they do what the federal government eventually did, which was to storm that classroom? We want the full answers, not half-truths, not innuendo, not finger pointing. We need all of the information, all of the body cam footage, not just portions of it like we got yesterday.
Now, the mayor is complaining about what the state is revealing and not revealing, but what has the mayor been helpful in revealing?
Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, the city, and he told me today that he was going to ask DPS for all of their body cams. I hope that means that we'll get all of the city body cams as well, because that's really what we need to do here. We need to pull off the Band-Aid, lay blame if it needs to be, but more importantly for me, I need to make sure that this never happens again. We had every law enforcement agency in that building, the radios were inoperable. So even if this guy was the incident commander, nobody's radios worked. That makes zero sense to me in 2022.
Texas State Senator Roland Gutierrez, thank you very much for joining us again tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A lot of threats, wishing death upon me, telling me that, I'll be in jail with my mother, and saying things like, be glad it's 2020 and not 1920.
Election workers around the country have suffered greatly because of the lies Donald Trump has told about them. But Shay Moss and her mother, Ruby Freeman, have suffered the most, having been specifically publicly named by Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani as responsible for Donald Trump's loss to Joe Biden in Georgia.
Were a lot of these threats and vile comments racist in nature?
A lot of them were racist. A lot of them were just hateful. But yes, sir.
In one of the videos we just watched, Mr. Giuliani accused you and your mother of passing some sort of USB drive to each other. What was your mom actually handing you on that video?
A ginger mint.
The attacks unleashed by Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani have changed their lives.
Don't do nothing anymore. I don't want to go anywhere. I second guess everything that I do. It's affecting my life in a major way, in every way. All because of lies. For me doing my job, same thing I've been doing forever.
There is nowhere I feel safe. Nowhere. Do you know how it feels to have the President of the United States to target you? The President of the United States is supposed to represent every American. not to target one, but he targeted me, Lady Ruby.
Joining us now is Georgia State Representative Bee Wynn. She is the winner of Georgia's Democratic primary for Secretary of State. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. As you were watching that testimony yesterday, what were you thinking about how the Secretary of State can help protect election workers in Georgia?
Well, I want to put some context to what led up to that moment. And as a lawmaker in Georgia, I was a member of the committee that oversees election laws. And I remember early on in 2020, Republicans started this concerted effort to sow seeds of doubt as it pertains to the validity of absentee ballot voting. And in retrospect, I understood that was part of the plan that they were using to justify this attempt to overturn the results of the election. It was our Georgia legislature that enabled and allowed Rudy Giuliani and Trump's legal team to come into our House and come into our Senate and subject us and the public to hours and hours of lies and misinformation. And ahead of that hearing, we were warned. We said, folks told us, take your address down, lock down your social media. If you speak up against them, you will be a target for Republicans. And during that time, when Miss Ruby Freeman was on there and Miss Moss, they were the subject of attacks. There were multiple times in which I said, we have got to protect these election workers. We cannot allow them to come into our legislature and put targets on two women's backs, two women who are doing their jobs during a pandemic. And that's exactly what being complicit in this looks like. And it all led up to that moment of January 6th, where we saw that attack on our nation, where we saw attempts to overturn the will of the people and the denial of peaceful transfer of power. So protecting election workers means we've got to absolutely mitigate election disinformation. And we've got to absolutely hold everybody accountable who was complicit in all the things that led up to this moment.
Republicans are on an active nationwide campaign to take over Secretary of State in every state they possibly can, especially the swing states that could vote either way in presidential elections. The Republicans already hold the Secretary of State position in Georgia. You're trying to take it away. What is your case to Georgia voters on why it's important for you to serve as Secretary of State?
Everything that we're seeing in Georgia and across the nation, it is all intertwined. That concerted effort, the complicity of everything leading up to January 6th, those things were also utilized to pass voter suppression bills across our entire country, and including in the state of Georgia, where we have a 98-page voter suppression bill that criminalizes handing out a bottle of water to a voter waiting in line, but also enables a partisan legislature and a partisan state board of election to take over our local election boards. And we've got to have a Secretary of State who's not just willing to uphold the law, but also one that supports voter expansion, who is going to fight against these voter suppression policies and the subversion of democracy.
Thank you very much for joining us. Bee Wynn, candidate for Secretary of State in Georgia. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
And coming up, on my last day, as I was telling Rachel, on my last day working in the United States Senate, Mark Shields, always working his beat as a reporter, was still pumping me for information about what was going to happen next in the Senate. And as we sat there talking, me in a T-shirt and jeans, Mark Shields watched me do something I might have trouble explaining to other reporters. I counted out $10,000 in cash right there on the bench we were sitting on in a low traffic area of a congressional office building. I had just sold my Harley Davidson downstairs in the Senate garage to a guy who worked in the Senate garage and always admired it. It was the one thing I loved that I was going to leave behind in Washington. I knew Mark Shields would understand because he understood so much. Mark Shields' funeral today in Washington was packed, standing room only. The wit and wisdom of Mark Shields is next in tonight's last word, in his own words. Mark Shields grew up in a suburb about 10 miles south of my Boston neighborhood of Dorchester. Mark spoke for many of us when he wrote, "In my Irish-American Massachusetts family, you were born a Democrat and baptized a Catholic. If your luck held, you were also brought up to be a Boston Red Sox fan.
My brother, sadly, has done very well and become a Republican because we were born Democrats and baptized Catholics, I think is the way that it was put to us. He's very well. He's terrific, and I talked to him yesterday, and we occasionally argue about politics, but not with great affection and admiration.
Great affection and admiration is what everyone who knows Mark Shields has always felt for him. We can thank the legendary Meg Greenfield at the Washington Post for converting Mark Shields from a political campaign strategist to a clever and wise columnist.
Meg Greenfield, I'd written a piece, I'd written a couple of pieces, op-ed pieces at different times. I hadn't been in journalism, I'd been in politics. And she approached me and said, would you like to write political editorials for the Washington Post? And I, not knowing any better, I said, yeah, but those are unsigned. I've got to get some ego satisfaction. And she said, okay, you can write a once-a-week column. So I did that from 1979 through the campaign in 1980, and covered the whole campaign, which was great.
Mark Shields glided into TV commentary, first on CNN's Capital Gang, and then for 33 years on the PBS NewsHour. I always turned up the volume whenever I saw Mark Shields on television. Television audiences don't talk back, but lecture audiences do. And Mark Shields was a star on the lecture circuit.
Sense it's a challenge. I mean, you've got, 45 minutes to make them think, make them laugh, and that's the highest praise you can get coming out. Is someone coming up, and which occasionally happens, said, "You made me think and you made me laugh," and boy, that's high praise indeed for me as a speaker.
No one made me think and made me laugh like Mark Shields. Mark Shields loved politics, not so much for the sport of it, but for the power of politics to help improve the human condition. As a journalist, he was always fair, but he was not shy about publicly admiring the politicians who merited his admiration. One was the Speaker of the House from Massachusetts, Tip O'Neill, who Mark Shields once said was a stranger to self-importance. Leave it to Mark Shields to create the perfect phrase describing Mark Shields: a stranger to self-importance. He was in awe of Mike Mansfield, the longest-serving majority leader of the United States Senate in history, not because Mike Mansfield was a glamorous political star who delivered inspiring speeches. His admiration for Mike Mansfield begins with Mike Mansfield forging a birth certificate to join the Navy when he was 14, then joining the Army after that, then joining the Marine Corps after that.
He goes on to become a professor of Asian history at the University of Montana, gets elected, serves 34 years in the Congress of the United States, majority leader longer than anybody in history. United States ambassador to Japan under both President Carter, asked to give the President Reagan, and when he dies, written on his tombstone at Arlington, at his request, is Michael Joseph Mansfield, born March 16, 1903, died October 5th, 2001. Private, United States Marine Corps. No majority leader, no ambassador to Japan.
What you see in Mark Shields' admiration of others is a reflection of Mark Shields' values. After serving 2 years in the Marine Corps in the early 1960s, he was working in the Senate in 1965 when the crusade for the Voting Rights Act was the news of the day every day. The Democratic majority leader, Mike Mansfield, held a 4 o'clock press conference every day with the Republican minority leader, Everett Dirksen, in front of the minority leader's office, not the majority leader's office, which would be the normal protocol. Mark Shields tells the rest of the story as no one else can.
After a couple of weeks of this, chief of staff of another Midwestern Democratic senator comes to see Mansfield's top guy and says, look, every day they have these meetings outside of Dirksen's office. Couldn't we at least a couple of days a week have it outside of Mansfield's office so people would say the Democrats, the Democratic president's pushing this, Democratic leader. Mansfield's guy goes to see him and says, Senator, this has been brought to me. I think it's a legitimate complaint. Can we do it? And Mike Mansfield turns on his staff person, very close to him. He said, let me tell you one thing certain. You understand, last year, in 1964, the Republican Party lost its way on Abraham Lincoln's values of civil rights, and with Barry Goldwater, whom I happen to like, but he was absolutely wrong. And they suffered a terrible defeat. Anything that helps American people to see the Republican Party is returning to the values of Abraham Lincoln is good for the Republican Party, and it's good for the United States of America. I don't want the subject brought up again. Now that, to me, is leadership of just, noble.
Of all the politicians who Mark Shields worked with before becoming a journalist, there was no experience like working with Bobby Kennedy.
I went to work for him when he ran for president in 1968 and was in Nebraska and Oregon and then in California for the California primary, which he won, of course, and then was murdered. I just felt about Robert Kennedy, there's two types that we're always looking for in American politics. We're looking for a conservative with an obvious heart, who you can say, gee, there's a real human quality to him. And then you're looking for a liberal who's tough, who's got a real backbone. And I just felt that Robert Kennedy was the embodiment of that. I think he was, in many respects, the last tough liberal this country's had.
Mark Shields left us on Saturday at the age of 85. His funeral mass today at the Shrine of the Most Blessed Sacrament in Washington, D.C.